As the war crimes of Israel continue in Gaza, protests across the world are continuing to grow. On Tuesday, scores of protesters descended on Liverpool Street Station in London, calling for a ceasefire and an end to the siege. You can see there are a sit-down protest, Palestinian flags waved, lots of people chanting for a ceasefire. Now, some people might think it's heartening to see people protest against the bombing of hospitals and refugee camps, but not everyone agrees. Historian Simon Sharma tweeted this: "Don't anyone tell me how peaceful and humane these demonstrations are. Intifada at the railway station." Now, interestingly, in the video Sharma is sharing, protesters are not shouting Intifada. Listen for the chant here. So they're very clearly chanting ceasefire now. I don't know how you get intifada. I don't know how you would hear that and think that they were shouting intifada. Sharma did accept he got that wrong, but only 20 hours later. So he'd got a lot of retweets before he retracted. In terms of people hearing what they want to hear as well, Rachel Riley tweeted the same clip, exactly the same clip we've just shown you there, and complained people were chanting jihad now, jihad now. She went on to delete that as well, presumably accepting that they were in fact chanting ceasefire now. Karen Pollock was another tweeter, unimpressed by the display of solidarity for Palestinians. Pollock is chief executive of the Holocaust Educational Trust, and she said this: "It should not be difficult to understand or recognize that this is an intimidating atmosphere for Jewish people on their way home from work. Many have had to turn back. Chants from the river to the sea are calling for the destruction of Israel, the only Jewish state. Enough." Now, interestingly here, you can see a banner, which is actually in the video, which is shared by Karen Pollock, saying Jews against genocide. So she's saying Jews will be intimidated by this. Clearly, there are a fair few number of Jews there who are against genocide. And considering she's from the Holocaust Memorial Society, one would have thought that Jews against genocide would be something she would be somewhat amenable to taking on board. The government got in on the act too. Transport Secretary Mark Harper said this: "The situation earlier this evening at Liverpool Street Station will have been of concern to many people. I've been in contact with British Transport Police and will be meeting officers later this week. Everyone should feel safe when using our rail network." In terms of coverage of the protest from the mainstream media, though, so I've sort of shown you some sort of interest groups, pundits, politicians. This is how the media covered it. This is from The Express. Pro-Palestine protesters lock down major London station, creating rush hour commuter chaos. And this is a subheading. "A sea of people have been pictured in the centre of London's Liverpool Street Station, many of which are armed with emotively written banners." Barnaby, does anyone have anything to fear from protesters armed with emotively written banners?
When people are chanting ceasefire now under a banner that reads Jews against genocide, if you're threatened by that, you might want to consider that you may be on the wrong side. I think it's important, though, to understand why people are threatened by that. It's important to understand something about how Zionism works, how it thinks. It represents both an attempt to enter into a kind of whiteness, to lose, Daniel Kahn, one of my favorite Yiddish songwriters, sums up Zionism as "who wouldn't want to win when all we'd ever done was lose." It's an attempt to remove Jews from one kind of coalition of the marginalized, excluded, exploited, and loathed by Western civilization, which is what Jews always were, since the death of Jesus at least, and to put us in another coalition, the coalition of the winners, of the Western and the powerful. Theodor Herzl had been an assimilationist, the founder of modern political Zionism, had wanted Jews to give up on their Jewishness, and his turn to Zionism was a kind of recognition, in my mind, that the only way to become good Europeans was ironically to leave Europe in order to have what all good Europeans had, which was a nation state, ideally a colonial nation state. So on the one hand, Zionism is a supreme form of attempted entry into whiteness. And that's, of course, how Palestinians encounter it as a process of European colonization. But in its own mind, and to many Jews, it's also sustained by the deep anxieties of histories of persecution, which mean that when you see people objecting to carnage, when you see people objecting to hospitals being bombed, if you have been taught a tradition that worries about your own marginalization and persecution, as I was raised, then it's easy to read every kind of declaration of solidarity with those being massacred as an attack on you. The beautiful message then, the wonderful truth that the anti-Zionist Jew learns is that, in fact, we can be part of those coalitions that we were part of for centuries. The coalitions that yearn not for our protection at someone else's cost, but for a kind of universal freedom. This was never the only Jewish tradition, but it was one Jewish tradition. That generalized from our own experience of persecution and domination to seek a world without persecution and domination for anyone. That knew when European colonizers spoke a language of hatred to inferior others, that they had honed that language over centuries in Europe against Jews, who were not simply regarded as inferior, but as crafty and terrifying outsiders who could come to dominate them. We know that the fear of others and the attempt to dominate them was honed against us. And so we as Jews seek to do the most Jewish thing of all, which is to be in the crowd at Liverpool Street, to be in the demonstrations in London and in other cities and towns over recent weeks that have been full of people from every background, united only by horror at the carnage and hope that people can be free. We know that the most Jewish thing of all is to be there opposing a whole world order of Western civilization that was for so long predicated on our destruction and is now predicated on the destruction of others. And so the really Jewish thing to do is not to join that awful kind of civilization, but is to follow the words of our great prophet Isaiah, who chastised Jews for fasting and said, you hope that God will bless you because you're fasting, but this is not a real fast. A real fast is when you stop oppressing your workers and let the captives go free. That's the message that our prophetic tradition brings to us. Do not mistreat a stranger, for you were once a stranger in a strange land. Let my people go, said Moses to Pharaoh in Egypt. And when they left, they didn't leave alone, but they took with them the mixed multitude from Egyptian society, the oppressed and exploited who wanted to escape too. So that's the great Jewish tradition. And people may be intimidated by it because their minds have been conquered for so long by Zionism and anxiety. But there is a much more beautiful and really rich and true Jewish tradition that could bring people out onto those protests. So I hope to see lots of Jews on these protests, as we've seen hundreds and hundreds of Jews in Jewish blocks and all over the demonstrations in recent weeks.
My knowledge of scripture isn't amazing, so I won't try and pick you up on any of those points. I'm going to have to take that as a given. I want to show one more response to the protest, which I found actually, I think this is what I found the most grotesque. And it's from the Jewish labor movement. So they have tweeted, so they're tweeting a tweet by Lee Harpin, who works for the Jewish Chronicle. And he is pointing out that Faiza Shaheen has posted a video on her Instagram of this protest. And the Jewish Labour movement say this: we expect all Labour parliamentary candidates, not least those with sizable Jewish communities in the seat they're contesting, to take more care sharing material, which is more likely to inflame community tensions than calm them. Aspiring MPs should bring people together. Now, I've spoken to Faiza Shaheen. She said that actually, and she told Lee Harpin this, she wasn't on the demonstration. Obviously, I don't think there would be anything. I think it would be great if she was on the demonstration. She shared this video. And Lee Harpin from the Jewish Chronicle making a big deal of this, I think, that's to be expected. He is basically a troll. But the Jewish Labour movement sort of saying about a Muslim prospective parliamentary candidate, oh, why is this prospective parliamentary candidate at this demo? That could offend people from certain communities. Well, the Jewish Labour movement just yesterday actually backed Keir Starmer's opposition to a ceasefire. They're saying a ceasefire would be the wrong thing to do. And I'd have to say to the Jewish Labour movement, do you not recognise that there are some communities in the UK that think opposing a ceasefire is damaging to community tensions? I don't know if they've noticed, but it is the case. It's not just Muslims who are opposed to this dreadful war, but it is disproportionately Muslims who feel incredibly passionate about the fact that the carpet bombing of the Gazans is not a good thing. So when JLM sort of say, no, we're absolutely opposed to a ceasefire, I don't see that as a group of people who are prioritizing, peace between different communities. And so it seems to me that there is this demand that Muslims are very, very considerate of even the mere notion that they might offend a Jewish person's perspective when it comes to foreign policy. But when it comes to a Muslim who might be offended by a perspective on foreign policy, i.e. we should keep bombing Gazans, they don't seem to have to show the same sensitivity. Barnaby, what do you make of this? I find this very concerning, actually.
It is concerning how quickly we slip from discussion of Israel and Israeli crimes to discussion of Jews and Jewish feelings and thoughts and concerns in Britain. It is a conflation that is, of course, endemic to anti-Semites to collapse any distinction between the Israeli state and world Jewry, to read the Israeli state simply as the voice of every Jew all over the world. And it is a conflation that means that if I walk to synagogue wearing a kippah, a skull cap, I am more likely to be attacked. And so the left does extremely important work in clarifying that the state of Israel is just another settler colonial state. The state of Israel exists as a byproduct of Western imperialism. The state of Israel exists as a violent society predicated on the domination of natives and supported by Western power, which sees in it a regional ally, just as apartheid South Africa existed, and just as Algeria existed, and just as Vietnam existed, and just as so many settler colonial societies across the world have existed, propped up by imperial violence. In other words, the fact of the Jewishness of the state of Israel, though it is crucial to Israelis and to Zionists, is certainly not what matters to Palestinians, who don't care what the religion of their colonizer and dispossessor is, but care that they've been colonized and dispossessed. So insisting constantly on the fact of Israel's Jewishness as the most important thing about it is both a mechanism for putting Jews in danger in Britain by associating Israel not with a problem of imperialism that we have to destroy, but with Jews. And it is also a mechanism for silencing, yet again, of course, here's the colonial hierarchy, the experiences of Palestinians for whom the Holocaust is a deep tragedy, but not one that they committed, for whom centuries of European Christian anti-Semitism are a deep tragedy, but not crimes that they committed, and who wish to live in peace and freedom in their own homes, but are told when they ask to live in peace and freedom in their own homes that they're not sufficiently considering the feelings of the people who've colonized them and stolen their homes. Just think for a minute what it would be like to experience that. If you're watching this right now, and we hear a lot about Muslim community feelings. It's not just about the Muslim community. If you're from anywhere in the world that was colonized, you know something about how that feels. To have your land taken from you, your history taken from you, your history just becomes another narrative that you like to tell, your food taken from you and claimed as the food of the colonizer, everything about your identity and experience taken from you, either denied and ignored or actively maligned and suspected. You're called a terrorist, you're called all kinds of judgmental things, and your experience isn't played back in the world. The experience of the colonizer is instead played again and again and again. That is an experience that is common to everyone from South Africans to Black people in America growing up reading literature until at least very recently, where all the good guys in kids' stories were white faces. The idea of the complete invisibilizing of your experience is something that will be familiar not just to Muslims, though it's certainly familiar to Muslims after 20 years after 9/11 in Britain, but to so many people from all over the world. But if you're white, I ask you to imagine it, because it's not something familiar to you, that your experiences are not taken seriously. So there's a lot of very concerning things going on here. And the left has a very important role to play constantly in opposing anti-Semitism, which always rises in times like this. And there is a rise in anti-Semitism now, a violent and a dangerous and a worrying rise from Dagestan to London. It is very important that we have the left to oppose that anti-Semitism, to oppose it regardless of what its victims think about the state of Israel, to have a principled opposition to anti-Semitism in all cases, and to stress that we want a world in which everybody lives in freedom, whether they're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim. And yes, we think that includes the taking apart of a state apparatus predicated on domination, the Zionist state in Palestine, so that everyone from the river to the sea can live in equality and freedom. That's our vision. And that's the vision that leads people in Liverpool Street Station to chant ceasefire now. And those who would talk about threats to Jews while having nothing to say or actively supporting violence against others, they're not consistent anti-racists.